Chris, I appreciate that. Just to add to my bio a little bit, coming from Baylor, I did RUF, Reformed University Fellowship, which is my denomination's campus ministry at Baylor. Had a lot of students come through Baylor's Great Text program, and had a lot of friends who were who taught either in the English department or the Great Text program, and 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 also my son is a freshman at Biola, and he's in the Torrey Honors program. So we have not only connections to the Great Text world, but we value the the philosophy of the education and the system, and so I appreciate Gutenberg and what they're doing here, and appreciate the opportunity to be here with you guys. A little bit else about my bio, just so you understand some of where I'm coming from. As I talk about these things, when I think about my role and how to interact with any kind of particular topic, I think about it in terms of my own story, and in terms of, as a pastor, I think about it in terms of my own ministry. Some of this may be relatable to you guys, some of it may not. But I grew up in the church from birth, in a very kind of evangelical denomination, broadly evangelical in the best sense of that word. But also grew up with a lot of fundamentalist influences, and actually one strong fundamentalist influence that is tips into being very cult-like. And so when I think about the Bible and how to talk about the Bible as literature, part of what I'm maybe speaking to even tonight is my own ghosts, my own story, my own past. In that world, the Bible was seen as primarily, I would say, just a repository of pristine truths that if you knew what you were doing, you could mine the Bible for those truths and have unfettered access to them. And those truths tended to be reduced, I would say reductionistic, down to principles for living, aphorisms, rules. So the Bible was seen more of maybe a survival manual or a guidebook for life. So the notion of Bible as literature would have certainly been off-putting to me and many of those people in that world. I don't remember ever hearing that kind of language growing up in the church. But then I moved on and moved into I would say a more stable evangelical place, and certainly was connected to my roots. But when I went to seminary, I began to engage the expository discipline, exegetical disciplines, came in formal contact with the grammatical historical method. Was in a denomination at that time that was still within that, within a similar evangelical world, that had a stronger theological awareness. And that was where I first began to see the Bible not simply as a repository of truth, but connected in terms of theology. Most of that theology tended to be systematic theology, which runs a lot of the same paths as that first world I was in, but it was a fleshing out, and it was a growing beyond those things. It was drawing connections and teaching an approach to the scriptures that was certainly, I would argue, better than before. And then I moved into through seminary and through contact with the Reformed world, the denomination that I'm in now, came in contact not only with robust systematic theology, but began to engage in biblical theology and a deepening understanding of redemptive history. And it was then that I began to hear people trade in the language of the Bible as literature, the Bible as story, a real strong commitment to putting the component parts, systematic theology, putting it into a narrative rather than just allowing it to sit as a thing in itself. as a biology major, I tend to think about that turn as the turn from the lab to the field, right? Every biologist worth their salt is going to dissect dead things, right? To come to some understanding of that thing, but to think that by dissection we've come to understand the thing itself, we're fooled. If that's what we think, we need to understand a frog. We need to see it function in its environment, in its surroundings. We need to watch it do things. And so when I think about how I want to engage the scriptures, it's with both those things at work. That dissection component, the grammatical historical method, is obviously a useful tool, but it I think creates harm if that's the only thing you're operating with. I think it's good lab work, but it's not good field work, if you will. And so to add to that story, I'm now 20 years in ministry. And so as I think about tonight and where we are and what I want to bring to the table, it's really that story, but now through the lens of practitioner. And not that scholars and academics aren't practitioners, but I mean that in terms of I'm not coming at this as one who has spent focused attention on the literary aspects of the Bible. I can mildly understand speech act theory, but I'm not a speech act theorist. I'm going to talk about drama and improvisation, but I'm not studied in theater. But I've pulled these things into my language and in my understanding of how we relate to the Bible, because as a minister, one, I believe it's important for my own continuing education, but I also believe that these things are important for the conversation I'm going to have tomorrow over coffee with the person who suffered a huge disappointment or a grief or a failure in their life. Or I should add the person who's met some great joy or hope or love, right? That the things that we encounter in life, we believe that the scriptures touch on all of those things. So that's where I'm coming from. That's what's underneath what I'll present tonight. My sister, I have an older brother who's 3 years older than I. My sister is 3 years younger than I. Then I have another sister 5 years younger than that, and another sister that's 12 to 15 years younger than that. I have to do the math, and I don't have it in front of me. But my sister that's 3 years younger, we were getting ready for school one morning, and my mom shouted that there was a mouse under the sink. And we all run. Of course, we want to see the mouse, and the mouse then has run out of the kitchen from under the sink and found its way under the couch in the living room. And there is a door and the back door. And so my mom says, okay, and the couch is over here. I'm going to move the couch. Shara, you here, my sister, you sit here with this rolled up magazine, and Sean and Shaynor, this door over here was a wide door, so we needed two of us to guard that door. And all we were supposed to do is to bang the magazines on the floor if the mouse were to run our way, and to shoo it just out the back door. My mom just wanted it out of the house. My sister is panicked. She's in tears. She thinks this is the worst idea in the world. She wants nothing to do with it. We coax her into it. My mom moves the couch. And of course, the mouse runs straight for her. Straight at her. And I remember this so well, because she freezes, and you think that she's not going to react, but she reacts too late, and instead of hitting the floor before the mouse comes to her, she hits the floor and winds up hitting the mouse. And the mouse does this bounce and then lands on the floor and doesn't move. And she loses it. She loses it. And I tell you that story and to illustrate one thing, one primary thing. I realize you don't know my sister, and that if you knew Shara, that story might actually shift a bit in your reception of it. But I tell you that story for another reason, because that story is a story that's shared among my family, and when we would go camping or go home for Christmas or whatever it is, my oldest son, who's about to be 19, would invariably say, "Dad, tell the story about Aunt Shara and the mouse." And the reason that that story is here and a part of the lore is because it's a story that situated my son in the story of his own family. It situated him in his relationship to me, to my sister, his broader family. It gave him a sense not just simply of something that happened in the past, but who he is in relationship to the people involved in that story. And that's what story does. Story situates us into our own story, but the biblical story situates us into our own story as well as the story of what God is doing in the world. So my goal tonight is to kind of step into the description, step into the series, and step into the two questions that Chris sent out to those who he invited to be a part of this. The two questions I intend to step into is, what should we make of the fact that the Bible is written largely in the form of narrative, that it's largely written as story? And then how can our understanding of literature, of narrative, of story, make us better hearers and doers of the word? Those are the two questions I want us to think about, I want to address. I think I want to reframe the question maybe this way: what is the goal of the reading and interpretive endeavor? What are we trying to do as we read the text? Or I could say my goal is to invite us and to push us a little bit to consider the relationship between the biblical story and performance of that story. So, first thing I want to say about the Bible as story is just, this is maybe a bit of splitting of hairs, but I think when we unpack it, it becomes essential for us understanding that concept. When we think about the Bible as narrative, we need to think about it in terms of two aspects. One is that the Bible is written largely in narrative form, right? The Bible contains predominantly narrative, story after story after story. And so when we think about narrative or story, we're thinking about it in terms of a genre within the Scriptures. But I think it's also essential for us, if we're going to understand how to be better hearers and doers of the word, to understand that the Bible as a whole is also a story. It's also a narrative. It's a narrative that from beginning to end has a cohesive plot movement. And the various genres that the Scriptures hold are not simply broken down into their component parts. We certainly dissect them, and when we're trying to interpret the Bible, we want to look at poetry and differently than we look at narrative and apocalyptic narrative or apocalyptic whatever broader genre that goes in. We want to look at that different than we do historical narrative, to be sure. But those genres fit within an overarching story. That story has been described as creation, fall, redemption, consummation. I like the language of creation, rebellion, redemption, restoration. But there's a narrative arc to the Bible. And so as we approach it, we're approaching not just the fact that the Bible has stories, but that the Bible is a story. I think about this in terms of, I'm recently reading Susanna Clark's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Have any of you guys read this? So she's telling this, it's a novel, she's telling a novel, but within the world that she's constructing, she also footnotes other works that exist in that world, right? She's adding in this other genre to tell a story. It's still a novel, but she has footnotes, and the footnotes don't correspond to anything that exists other than in her constructed world. However, I think that's how the Bible works with its genres within this greater concept of story. Or I think Tolkien's always easy, or he's always on point. Maybe that's a better way to say it. But he uses songs, he uses history, poetry, all within the Lord of the Rings narrative, all within an overarching worldly story, world story. So when we think about the Bible, I think those two aspects are important. And when we think about how narrative shapes our doing, both aspects come into play. Christopher Wright, in his Old Testament Ethics for the People of God, says this about the Old Testament and in terms of its story qualities. I think this extends beyond the Old Testament, to be sure. He even says it somewhere, maybe even in this quote. But I wanted to read this. That the Old Testament tells a story needs no defense. The point is much greater, however. The Old Testament tells its story as the story, or rather as a part of that ultimate and universal story that will embrace the whole of creation, time, humanity within its scope. In other words, in reading these texts, we are invited to embrace a meta-narrative, a worldview, that like all worldviews and meta-narratives claims to explain the way things are, how they have come to be so, and what they ultimately will be. He then goes on to say, now the reality of this story is such that it includes us in the scope, us in its scope, for it points to a universal future that embraces all the nations. This is the story of God, Israel, and the nations, taken up without question in the New Testament. This is the story that stretches from Genesis to Revelation, not merely as a good yarn or even a classic or epic literature, but fundamentally, I love this, but fundamentally as a rendering of reality, an account of the universe we inhabit and of the new creation we are destined for. We live in a storied universe. So, the Bible as story, both story within the story. The other thing I'll throw out there for caveats, I don't think I have to do this for anybody in the room. I don't know, though, so I'll put it out there. When I use the language of story, this maybe is speaking to my old self that I described earlier. It in no way implies fiction or untruth. I don't use, and that language does not necessitate or imply fiction. The other thing about it, I'll just to be fair, my use of we is certainly a generalization. I'll use it throughout. And it's a generalization just to Protestant evangelicals. And again, I use the word evangelical in the best historic sense of that word. I know I'll confess that I've become trepidatious about self-identifying as evangelical of late, but I think in the best historic sense of that word, I think it's a great word. This is the tribe that I've lived with, wandered the wilderness with for nearly 15 years. So that's how I identify. But I also want to say that I don't intend to exclude any Christ followers from that language either. Though I realize that my experiences shapes that word, and not all experiences will be able to relate to everything that I include in we. All right, I think that's enough caveats on that. So as we think about the Bible as story, then I think it as narrative, and both in the narrow sense and the broader sense, it presents a bit of a problem that I think is what is set before us in the whole series, which is what does that mean for us, both in hearing the word and doing the word? We can take on a posture toward literature and story that still just does lab work, still just breaks it down into its component parts, just does dissection. But is that enough? How do we approach then narrative that leads to obedience, doing, application, right? James 1, be doers of the word, not hearers only. The passage that evangelicals hang a lot of their identity on, the 2 Timothy 3:16 passage, all scripture is God-breathed and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training. And this is a good and right impulse, but it raises a serious question. And Christopher Wright helps us with this because he's dealing with the Old Testament. I don't think this is simply a question or a problem for our approach to the Old Testament. I think we struggle with it in the New Testament as well, but I think with the Old Testament it just gets highlighted more because of the historical distance from the Old Testament and the fact that most of it is narrative. And so though we know that the Bible, and we assume, and as evangelicals we embrace the idea that the Bible has something to say about what we do, how we live, we don't really always know what that means. And that becomes highlighted when we approach, I think, especially narrative. He puts the question, again, Wright puts the question this way: if the Old Testament text is not telling us what we ought to do directly, and it usually isn't, is there any way in which it is telling us what to do at all? And how can we find that out and articulate it, right? I think we would all, where I grew up, the different places I've been would all agree that the Bible, the Old Testament, the narrative is inviting us to do things, but how we get there and how we articulate it has been rather messy and confusing at times, certainly for me. So what do we do? The Old Testament, in this regard, highlights our lack of clarity for the relationship between narrative and doing is basically my point. It accounts for much of the reduction of the Old Testament narratives to things like character stories, be like David here, but don't be like David there. We often wind up squinting at the Old Testament to rescue the story's protagonist from his own folly or even villainy, right? We do Jedi mind tricks to kind of get ourselves out of some of the treachery that's just described by some of our heroes in the Bible. And I think one of the things that this actually brings into the evangelical world that has largely eschewed the allegorical hermeneutic is we wind up with an allegorical application. We wind up with application that's divorced from the narrative. It just comes in kind of alien to the text and doesn't really then get us into that space where the narrative is actually leading to our doing. Again, the story of David is one that is often recited in this place and in this kind of conversation, but it's because it's helpful. We often reduce David down to leadership principles. And again, I'm not saying that there is nothing to be gained in terms of leadership from the story of David. But if that's all we're gaining, we're not getting the text. We're not allowing the story to shape our doing, I would argue. And so there are three primary issues that I think that I want to offer tonight. Preliminary, but I think these are important, that help us reframe our approach to biblical story so that we can be more faithful hearers and doers of the word. First one is we need a thicker understanding of what we mean by biblical truth, biblical authority. Second, I think we need, at minimum, a conceptual shift from application and obedience. I'm okay in some ways abandoning that expanding that language, minimizing that kind of language because it just has so much baggage with it, to the language of participation, to see what our encounter with, especially with narrative, but then again, if the whole Bible is story, then our encounter with the Bible, rather than thinking about being doers of the word simply as through the lens of application, seeing it through I think, a broader lens of participation. And third, with a thicker understanding of with that thicker understanding of biblical authority and with the concept of participation, then I think what comes is we're better situated into the story of God's love for the world. And that leads us to be more able doers of the word. In other words, to play our part. Kevin Van Hooser calls this move in dramatic fittingness. That the text is more than story. He wants to push into the metaphor of drama, and our participation in it is measured not by obedience as much as fittingness to the story. N.T. Wright refers to it as responsible improvisation. So, authority. What authority? Truth. What are we dealing with when it comes to that? How does maybe fleshing out or a thicker understanding there help us move down this path? One, we rightly see the Bible as authoritative. I've addressed that previously. But we've tended to see the interpretive ministerial endeavor as simply description of what's true in the Bible or what authority is held within it. This is where exposition has, in some ways, is a useful tool, but if it's all there is, we wind up simply with searching for, I don't know, I think about the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, right? I think when we're just doing exposition and we have a thin view of truth and thin view of authority, then what we drive at in that text is that Jesus is God. He commands the waves and the sea, which is true. However, that story is doing a lot more than that. And it's inviting us to participate in it in more than just an acknowledgement and an assent to the fact that Jesus is God. That's true. But there's more to the authority of the text than that kind of doctrinal truth, expositional truth. What the text says is what it tends to be reduced down, and I think we need to expand it into also what the text is trying to do, what the text is doing. So we are confronted with the dilemma in the narrative doer nexus of, and we might ask, how do we do the story of David and Goliath, right? When we think about narrative, how do we do that? How do we get from what the text says to what it is doing? Or we could even ask, how do we get from who do you think proved to be the neighbor, right? Jesus asked at the end of the story of the Good Samaritan, and he says, who do you think proved to be the neighbor? How do we get from that to being or doing, go and do likewise? Because when Jesus asked that question, he doesn't tell the man what to do. The story does not land on, this is what it looks like to be a neighbor in terms of application kinds of categories. It's an invitation to participate in something that story is inviting us to understand, to see. It's a construal of the world. It's a construal of the love of God. It's a construal of what neighbor is, right? So the man asks Jesus, who is my neighbor? And Jesus flips through the story and he says, who is the neighbor to the man? Right? He even shifts the question as he tells the story. So what does it look like to do whatever Jesus is inviting us to in the story of the Good Samaritan. I think parables and narrative are beautiful for this, and I think it actually is beautiful, and it's reason it's important to again keep in front of us that the Bible is story, is that narrative in terms of its call to doing is by design open-ended. And I don't mean that it has no parameters, and I don't mean to say that there is no thou shalt and thou shalt nots. There obviously is. However, there is more to it than that. Again, Christopher Wright sets the issue in front of us. The bulk of the Old Testament is not command, either in the sense of issuing commands to its first readers or to future generations of readers. So here's my thesis. We have tended to see biblical authority in its delimiting, simply and solely in its delimiting thou shalt and thou shalt not. We've reduced the concept of authority into that kind of space. And so when we've approached narrative, we tend to then put narrative in a kind of cauldron to render it down to some sort of principial application point that fits into that grid of thou shalt and thou shalt not, rather than seeing story as something that carries authority differently than that. It still carries authority, but it carries authority differently. Again, I'm relying a lot on Wright in this, but what he says is, he goes on to, he describes this a lot. He says authority is the predicate of reality. And what he means by that is it's not just a matter of positive directives. It's also legitimating permission. He says, when you get when you get a driver's license, that driver's license gives you authority. But it doesn't command when you drive and when you don't drive. It doesn't say you have to get out and drive your car every day at this time. And it actually it gives you the freedom in its authority to drive, legitimating what he calls legitimating permission. Authority authorizes, it grants freedom to act within boundaries, yes, but still to act freely. And so the Bible exercises authority most specifically, sometimes with direct and explicit commands, but in narrative, I think narrative is more often driving at the authority that's a legitimating authority. It's an authorizing, it's giving permission, it's an invitation into space to live and to act and to be. In short, narrative texts exercise authority by telling the truth about the world and then inviting the reader and hearer to assent to that truth, but not just assent to that truth, to indwell that world, to live in it. The remembered past, Van Hooser says it this way: the remembered past is rendered through a plot in which in turn renders a proposition, a possible way of viewing and living in the world. Narrative texts exert their authority by telling the reader the way things were in the past, and in so doing, they tell the reader that in some way, this is the way things are. This is the way things should be. The other thing that I think is the Bible brings to this conversation is that the Bible also ultimately tells us the way things will be one day. And so when we think about the Bible as narrative, it's not just historic truth that invites us to embody the way the world should be now, but it's the future of all things made new. That the story of the Bible invites us to inhabit in such a way that the future is lived in the present by our embodiment, by our participation in the story. Quoting again, if authority is the predicate of reality, this is right, then the authority of the canon of Scripture is that it brings us into contact with reality. Reading and knowing the Scriptures causes us to engage with that reality. That in turn functions to authorize and to set boundaries around our freedom to act in the world. So it's that dual reality, that dual relationship between boundaries and freedom, boundaries and acting. And this is where the dramatic and the theatrical metaphor begins to help. And I'll get there, but there's always this balancing act between freedom and rules, right? Think about improvisation. The best improvisers are skilled and practiced in their instrument, their craft. They know how to play their instrument. They don't just walk in and pick it up and start doing whatever they want. There's rules even with improvisation. And so when we talk about participation, we're talking about living fittingly within the world as God has described it. How God is living fittingly in the story and living out the story of what God is doing in the world. That brings us to the second thing, which is participation. The Bible doesn't just exercise its authority by giving us commands, but it authorizes us to participate in the story, right? When you think about where the story of redemption sort of takes its first huge, I could argue with myself about this, but one of the flags that is first planted in the story of God redeeming the world and undoing the effects of Adam and Eve's rebellion and all their descendants is the promise to Abram, right? Genesis 12. But what he says, look, I'm going to make you a blessing, I'm going to bless you, but that blessing is in order to bless. And God gives the law to Israel, and it circumscribes who they are as a nation and what it looks like for them to live in the blessing of God. But all of that is done in the context of this promise that as you do this, everything about what that means for you as a people is that you will live in such a way that you're a blessing for the sake of the world, the nations, the people around you. There's an authorization to take up the story, to participate in it. And this is the power of story and narrative, or drama. This is why I think the recovery of the literary aspects of the Bible. I'll tell this story. I remember I was in Old Testament class. When I took Old Testament at Baylor, everything was critical method. Everything was built around higher criticism. I got to seminary and I was hoping for something else because I'd begun to dabble in this stuff. Well, my professor had been trained under higher critic. That's the school she learned in. And so that's all she did. But I remember her giving us Robert Alter's The Art of Biblical Narrative. And Robert Alter, I don't think believes that the Bible story is more than fiction. I don't know, but from what I can tell, I don't think he does. But what I do know is that he saw the beauty of the narrative, and he started putting the pieces back together. And when he started doing that, the Old Testament just took on shape that it lost in all of that higher criticism, and it invited us in to participate and me to participate in a new way. And I would just argue that narrative is designed for that effect. It's not just the biblical narrative. I'm not a literary theorist, so I'd love to hear any feedback on this. But I believe narrative in all art forms are designed for affect, right? It's why I love Luna Lovegood and the Weasleys, and it's why I sat in my son's tree house at the end of reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road and just wept. Or it's why I have framed even some of my own trauma and working through my own trauma through Frodo's wounding at the hand of the Nazgul at Weathertop. Because those stories are decidedly fiction. They're not true, and yet there's an invitation even in those stories to be different, to change, to be affected by what's being told there. All story, I would say, then is crafted as invitation to laugh, to cry, to imagine, to embody, to take up, in other words, to participate. When we think about this from the angle of the Scriptures, one good example is to look at Moses as he's instructing the second generation of Israelites in the wilderness before they enter the promised land. And he's talking to them about how they'll talk to their children and answer their children's questions about the law once they've gone into the promised land. And here's what he says. He says, when your sons ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of this, the testimonies and the statutes and the rules the Lord our God has commanded you, say to your son, we were slaves, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and the Lord showed signs and wonders great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. So when we think about this text and what's going on there, it's important for us, again, to recognize the concept of participation right here on the surface of the text, right? The father in the scenario is a second generation Israelite. He did not participate in the Exodus physically. And when he's speaking to his son, he's surely talking to a son who did not participate in the Exodus or the wilderness wanderings, but when Moses instructs him what he shall say to his children, he says, look, say we, you, me, we, our family, our people, we were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out of Egypt. The father is using the first person plural pronoun in the presence of his son to invite them to take up the story of the Exodus and their deliverance as their own story. Not simply as some historic fact, but as something that they, in fact, participated in with God. To see themselves in the story as participants and receivers of that very thing. This comes to bear on the church when we remember that our belief in Jesus Christ, right? The Word of God, the authorized point of the story, makes Gentiles into sons and daughters of Abraham, according to Paul. Right? Or to put it in the words of Peter, once you were not a people, but now you are a people. Paul says it this way in Ephesians, remembering that you were at the time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant's promise. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near. Richard Hayes argues that this is the very application strategy of Paul throughout the New Testament. He says, I contend that Paul's pastoral strategy for reshaping the consciousness of his pagan converts was to narrate them into Israel's story, to write them into it, so that they are now God's people. They are now sons and daughters of Abraham. Commenting on 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 22, Hayes says this about Paul in his argument. He says, Israel's story is not somebody else's history. Rather, Paul addresses the Gentile Corinthians as though they have become part of Israel. They are invited to understand themselves now as descendants of the characters who appear in the pages of Scripture. That's from his conversion of the imagination. Or I think about this isn't specifically about writing Gentiles into the broader story of Israel, but it's still about participation. Paul, when he's addressing the church, the Galatian Christians, in chapter 3, he says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Who's fooled you? Was it not before your eyes that Jesus was portrayed as publicly crucified? Now, I've read a number of commentaries on Galatians, and none of them think that Paul's audience was literally at the crucifixion. None of them. They all understand that what Paul is referring to is their reception of Paul's gospel when he preached it. Right? But what Paul says is it's in hearing and being written into the story of God's salvation, you were ushered into the story and the very presence of the crucified Christ. Publicly, listen to that language, publicly portrayed as crucified before your eyes. I think, again, going back to my thesis, I think so much of how we think about our engagement with the text and what it is to be doers of the word has hinged for so long and too long, or maybe in just some circles too heavily, on the idea of the scriptures delimit. They just they tell us what we must do or what we mustn't do. I think about this in terms of I don't know. I don't know because I don't go into Christian bookstores anymore. But I remember having, what was it, the Concordance? Was it Strong's, or what was the real popular one? Where you just looked up any topic, and basically the way I grew up is anytime you wanted to address anything in your life, what you did is you approached it that way. You looked at the topical, you looked it up in the index, and you looked for the scriptures that touched on that topic as if that somehow addressed what needed to be said about that. And I think in some ways, some of the just if I'm right about some of the general confusion that exists currently in the evangelical church in terms of its cultural engagement and all kinds of things, I think at its root, that's at least partly at its root. I don't know if we can lay it all there, but it's that approach to Scripture, that seeing Scripture as this sort of delimiting document rather than a story that we're invited not only into but to take up and to participate in. And this leads us to the last thing, which is this participation is improvisational. So as we ask the question, how do we apply the biblical narratives? How do the narratives exercise authority? We've said that it exercises its authority certainly by its thou shalt and thou shalt nots, but also, and I would argue primarily or predominantly by inviting us, by writing us into the larger story of what God is doing in the world. So if we're going to continue to ask ourselves, what then are we supposed to do? How are we to participate? What guards our participation? We need to, I think, understand something of what improvisation is and isn't. N.T. Wright offers helpful discussion of this. But there's if you're not familiar, there's a whole slew of new writing, fairly recent writing out there in terms of how ethics is improvisational, and how theology is really, Van Hooser does the dramatic turn towards how we approach doctrine and the church and theology, and there's been even more pushing into that with the very specific conversation about improvisation. First thing I want you to understand about improvisation is it doesn't mean what it tends to conjure when we hear that word. When we hear that word, what it tends to conjure in our sense of what it means to improvise is it means to just make it up as we go. It's improvisation has a connotation, at least in our use of it, of being untethered from anything. When I think about this, when I think about improv and how this is important, and improvisation is important, one of my favorite shows is The Office, and if you're not familiar, one of the main characters, Michael Scott, is he is into improv. He goes to improv class, and there's one episode that actually shows him at improv class. And Michael Scott is a immature, kind of arrested development sort of man who is deeply insecure and unaware of other people. And he has this fictitious character that he likes to conceive of himself, and it's a kind of James Bond character. And so in improv class, what you watch Michael do is one time he's approached with a woman who's acting pregnant, and I think that's right, or maybe it's a child, and Michael Scott immediately shifts the scene that's presented him back onto his fictitious James Bond character and begins shooting everybody in the room. That's all he knows to do. And it's funny, it's a great scene. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. But one of the things about that scene is it's a perfect example of what improvisation is not. For him to play that scene fittingly, he would have to take up the story that's presented to him. And not just take it up to allow it to exist for what it is, but also then to enter into it and to play his part in that story. And yet what he continues to do is always turn the story that's presented to him with the one thing, the one bullet he's got in his gun. And in some sense, that's sort of what we've done, I think, in evangelical ministry. If the Bible is simply a delimiting document, that what we do when we are presented with a problem is we look at the topical index and we go, oh, you're struggling with depression. I'm going to look up all the biblical text on dealing with anxiety. Well, I hope this isn't controversial, but it might be. There's anxiety that sits across from us in a room that the Bible does not speak to. It does not speak to physiological, your alarm system is off, broken, you need something to in your brain to be put back into place. It just doesn't. Not in that kind of way. It does in a big picture God story of humanity and the restoration of all things kind of way. So if we're dealing with somebody who presents with a particular problem and all we know to do is to sort of go to the topical index, we wind up like Michael Scott, just pulling out our gun and playing Michael Scarn no matter what comes our way. And this is what I learned in ministry, is I would sit across from somebody and they would tell me their story, and I would just be like, I don't even know what to do with that. I don't know what to, there's no text to turn to a young girl who grew up with horrible abuse, and all she's known by the people that should have protected her was violence and destruction. I mean, there's certain things that the scriptures address about that, but walking her through what life looks like and how that's dealt with is something that can only be improvised. It's something that we take up our parts, and to take up improvisational parts well is to take it up in the context of the story that we know. So this is the first point. If the church is to improvise well, first place we need to start is to confess that our improvisation will only be fitting, right, as it accords with the story God is telling. So improvisation isn't simply up to me. Its fittingness comes into play when it takes up the story God is telling, which leverages onto us a high responsibility to know the story and to understand the story. And I would argue understand story, understand narrative, understand how the story is working. Keller talks about this. He had Tim Keller, a pastor in Manhattan, fairly well-known, prominent writer too, tells the story of a congregant who comes up to him and says, I always know when you're underprepared, because when you're underprepared, you quote and riff on Lewis, right? And his point, and the reason he tells that is because Keller has so read Lewis that when he doesn't know what to say, he bleeds Lewis. He doesn't have to think about it. It's just so embedded in who he is. He's so embraced it. So Keller's one of those people that if you said, what do you think Lewis would say about this? If, say, Lewis had never said a word about it, Keller could know Lewis well enough and say, I think Lewis would probably think this about that. That's the first step for us in terms of our fitting participation, our fitting improvisation. I think that's where there's such a lack among us, again, generalizing. We have to know the story and know it well. Second, that the pastor and we must treat the text the way Paul does. Again, Hayes says it this way: Paul did not treat the Old Testament as a rule book. Instead, he sketches a broad narrative and invites his readers to undertake the metaphorical leap, listen to this, of finding their own circumstances figured in the text. Ministry, what it looks like to see ministry as invitation into the story of God, looks like a willingness to allow people the room to play their part. And I've blown this, thinking that when somebody comes to me, I pull out my Michael Scarn gun and start shooting everybody, and actually doing harm to the story God is working out in that person's life. And it requires us to give people space and to invite them to see themselves in the story more so than tell them what they're supposed to do. Now there's caveats. There's time to say, yes, this, no, that. Again. Then finally, I think it's immersing his or herself in the story. As the person is doing this, and watching a model retelling of the story, as we do this, as we go through this process, we should put ourselves in situations where improvisation is not only happens, but is necessary. I think in order for the church to truly take up the story of what God is doing in the world, in other words, we must risk. We must risk putting ourselves into a position where we don't know exactly what God is doing or wanting from us, where we are acting on faith, where we are making our best effort. The church must give herself the opportunity to learn by doing. If part of the story is repentance, part of what we rehearse in the story of God in the world is repentance, then we need to learn to step into the places of risk where we might make a mistake. It's not better to be wrong conservatively than to be wrong liberally. It's just wrong. We need to learn to live in the space that God has called us into. I think we need to learn to take honestly what Paul means when he says it's for freedom that Christ set you free. So we will learn to improvise fittingly by improvising. And then by asking ourselves, did we improvise well or did we not? Did we play our parts fittingly or not? I think this is, Luther had no concept of this, but I think this is what Luther means when he says sin boldly. He's not saying disregard the commands of God. He's saying live, participate into what God has called you to. Don't live in fear. We're at time, but I'm going to close just with I can't go through my notes here, but I want to just say, I think Philemon is a case study in this. Paul is presented with a dilemma that's never existed in the world before that time, ever. It's the first time that you have a Christian master and a Christian runaway slave. And the question, what do we do with that? And Philemon is just a case study in improvisation. Paul is taking the gospel, because what does he say? He says, for love's sake. He doesn't tell either one of them what they must do. He says, I could require you to do this, but I won't. But for love's sake. And what I think is beautiful about Philemon in this regard is that you can't take what Paul does there seriously and ever own a slave again. Like, he doesn't take on slavery in some sort of diatribe against slavery, but he guts it in a moment by saying the story of the gospel invites you to live differently in the world than the story of Rome and the ancient Near East does in terms of humanity and property and rights. Right? So I think when you look at that story, I think it's a model that's been lost in how we read the text. And so improvisation is that. Okay, I'm gonna close with this story because I have it. It's good. I read this today. There's a story about children's story about a woman who lives in the hills. She's lived up there as long as anyone can remember, and she makes quilts. They're the most beautiful quilts, but none of them are for sale. She doesn't sell them. Instead, at night, she sneaks down to the city and gives these beautiful quilts to the poor and the homeless, those who don't have shelter, those shivering in the cold of night. In the land, there was a king who had everything except one of this woman's quilts. He knew he would not be happy until he had one, and so he offered her money and even banished her to death on a couple of occasions to try to leverage her to get her to give her a quilt, but she refused. She just said, "They're not for sale. They're for those who have nothing. I give them away." Finally, she agrees to give him one under one condition. And the story is about the king who has amassed everything and nothing's made him happy. And what she says is she would give him one if he would give everything away. Everything that he has away. Reluctantly and slowly he does this. And over time as he does that, he begins to change. He begins to respond differently to the begrudgingly giving things away, to finding delight in giving things away. So much so that when the time comes and he's finally given all of his stuff away and the woman gives him his quilt, he gives that away. And then he goes and gathers her quilts and sneaks down to the town at night and gives away her quilts to those in need. That story is a children's story, but it's a beautiful story of how participation in a different framework, in a different kind of story, in a new story, in a different story of possibility for the world and for yourself in that world, changes your interaction with the world itself. It changes you. That's what I think we need to be doers of the Word of God. I'm done.
I think we have some questions.
Thank you. Two more.
Actually, maybe this isn't fair because I don't have a question.
That's
I
okay.
was trying to think of a question, but I didn't want to not say anything because I just thought that was very good. It was excellent, I thought. So I was thinking I need to come up with some pithy question to show that I've been paying attention. I couldn't come up with one, so I just wanted to say I thought that was really good.
I appreciate that.
Your language is different than the way I would talk about it.
Okay.
So I had to think about it a little bit as we're going along because some of the words you use, I could imagine them going in a direction that I wouldn't be happy with at all.
Yeah.
But if I understand what you're saying, and I think I do, then
Which words feel that way?
well, of course, the big one is the improvisation one. But I think I know what you're saying, and I think I would really endorse that, actually. On this particular topic, my favorite language regarding this comes from David Crabtree, who was the president of Gutenberg for many years. We worked together for a long time and wrote a book on hermeneutics together. And but his language was, his pithy sort of statement was that you don't apply a verse, you apply a worldview. And I think it's the sort of thing that you're saying. That is, I am building a picture that God, through the Bible, is one who did this and promised this and values this and reacted with people in this way. And just like the way I get a picture of my parents' values and so forth by living with them, and that I get this, that then becomes the arena in which I live. And I have to make all sorts of decisions that may not have ever been covered but in the text, or, you know, if I'm a kid, my parents may have never said anything about this particular thing, but I know the terrain. And so that's what I'm picturing your improvisation as being, is that within that picture then, and the language you said, fittingly, and that sort of thing. So I just, I thought it was great.
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shaynor. I thought that was wonderful too. Improvisation, I think I can see how it, in a different context, might have a different sort of meaning. But I think in the musical context, I mean, it's just the sort of thing, I think, Ron, that you're talking about. Because, you know, if you're not in key, if you're not in time, there are so many... there really are a lot of constraints on what constitutes a successful improvisation that people actually enjoy. I mean, people know very quickly whether or not you're
good at it, right?
Right. And it's a skill as well, and it has to be practiced. And also, you are having to pay careful attention not only to musical principles, but what others around you are playing, for instance. Right. And so, you know, really, in order to improvise well in this sense, you have to not only be literate or conversant with the Bible, but literate, conversant with the culture, with the world, with the day in which we're living. So I think that's a really fantastic figure for that. I was going to ask you whether the same sort of relationship obtains between what we might call, you were talking about, you contrasted kind of dissection with, or lab work with field work, whether the same relationship between those two holds between, say, like letter of the law and spirit of the law, say, and whether this spirit of the law, which obviously is a big deal in the New Testament, whether walking in the Spirit, for instance, in John's language, although other New Testament writers use that too, whether that would be the same thing as improvising fittingly. Also, and I guess in this connection, I'm thinking of, you mentioned James. He says true religion consists in this. I believe it's visiting those in prison and caring for widows and orphans. And it's obvious that that is not an exclusive list of the things in which true religion consists. So it seems to me that this is an illustration, and whether that figure two, that term, is something like what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about pictures and illustration, and the parables are great examples of this. Yeah. We are being given lots of instances of what this improvisation looks like, or what this walking in the Spirit looks like. An example here, an example there, but really we have to create new illustrations in some ways in our own lives.
Yeah, I think so. And I think of like the example of James, and where he says, you know, this is. It seems like you could read it if you wanted to. It's him saying this is the sum total of true religion, right? But I think with, you know, our our understanding of literature and our embrace and broadening of and I think lack of suspicion towards good use of those categories, and we understand synecdoche or whatever how you say the word, right? That James is in that sense is using a part for the whole, or and so we I think it's throughout the scripture. The other example I think of in terms of how these things, how we're I think there's times where a text might be, in some sense, it's operating on both levels, right? So I think if you want to try to define true religion as in your own life, but you're neglecting the things in that list, and that's hard, right? But to say that it's only those couple of things that James lists there, you're wrong. Another one I think of is where we draw the appointment of deacons in our ecclesiology from. I'm not convinced that passage is intended to be prescriptive at all. What I actually think it's better to read it as a model for how you make decisions when you're confronted with a situation like, hey, we have people in our community that are being neglected. What are we going to do about it? Well, we need to appoint some people to deal with that. Now, having said that, I'm not arguing against the thousands of years of the diaconate, right? I think the diaconate can fittingly play the role that's being told, the story that's being told there about how the church addresses the question in front of it. So I'm not arguing that it's been wrong for us to do that, but I do think it might be wrong for us to use that in a delimiting way rather than saying, no, this is part of how we take up the story of God's love for the people in the margins, and a refusal with our community and within our means to show privilege toward those who are like us, rather than the Gentiles, and so I do think that as we move through the post-Christian turn, that very question may be one that the church needs to take up, like with honesty and maybe with some painful willingness to do some restructuring, to be honest, because I don't think that it's prescribing how the church must function organizationally for all time. I don't think that.
And so part of the question when it comes to passages like that is being able to tell the difference between an invitation into something participatory or improvisational, and these moments when there do seem to be, unquestionably, do this, don't do that sort of moments.
Yeah.
So it's...
I don't know. I don't want to answer that question.
Okay. I'm just
teasing. I mean, it's a great question. It's the question, right? That's the balancing act, and that's the invitation to step into that space, to play our part, and then to also have the ability to step back and go, no, that's not right. That's not good. That's not a fitting way of telling the story of God's love for the world. But I think with our, and this goes back to our view of authority, I think because of our view of authority and truth, we're so scared to ever get to that space where we try something like that and we look at it and go, that wasn't the best way to handle that situation. I can just assure you we're going to do that. We're going to make those mistakes. So I think it's better to make those mistakes seeking to embody the story rather than make those mistakes by holding down the fort, right? By being Michael Scarn and only shooting the one bullet we got. I think we're better off in the church. Van Hooser talks about, I wrote it down, this because I think this is what it leads to, and this is all, this breaks out into other things I love to think about, Jamie Smith book on how not to be secular, and how, that concept of re-enchanting the world. I think one of the ways you re-enchant the world is in story. You actually invite people into the notion that that what's happening in the world is a part of a story that's bigger, and it's magic, magic, like C.S. Lewis, Narnia. There's Elijah or Elisha, whichever it is, asking God to show his servant the angels that are encamped around him magic, like a donkey that talks to its rider magic. I don't know. I like the word magic because it kind of catches us off guard. If we say miraculous, we have a category for that word. But if I say magic, we're like, oh, what does he mean by that? Re-enchanting the world. But Van Hooser says this, that the church renders the story intelligible. So this is talking about what we do for our neighbors, right? When it lives out the truth of the gospel. Not when it argues truth. And I'm not saying arguing truth is not ever a part of living out the truth. But I feel like we've over-exercised that muscle to a degree, so that now the story of the gospel just has lost its not only intelligibility but its plausibility to our neighbors. And so I think we're better off stepping into that space from a posture of we're living out this story of God's love for the world. I think this is part of what Paul means when he says we're filling up what is lacking in Christ. There's nothing lacking in the atonement of Christ. But there is something unfinished about the story of what Jesus is doing in the world through his body, now us. And so the plausibility of that story comes not by how tightly we've delineated truth and can expound it to our neighbors, but how fittingly we've lived it out for the sake of our neighbors. Does that mean tracking with that? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, my privilege.